Hello, everybody, and welcome to another Sunday edition of Read and Talk about Gemmology. My name is Justin K. Prim. I'm going to be one of the hosts for tonight. Welcome back if you've been here before, and if you've never been here before, well, welcome for the first time. This is now our 10th month of this series where we've been talking to different guests from different parts of the gem and jewelry industry, the gemology world, the geology world, and the everything else fun and adventurous world of gemstones. And today we are excited to be talking to Emmanuel Fritsch about an update on color in gems. So if you've been here before, you know that kind of the theme of this series is to talk with a different author, whether that be a book author, a article author, a magazine editor, anything related to reading and talking about gemology, with the goal of getting you guys to read more and getting the behind-the-scenes story about some of these beloved books and articles that have helped shape our knowledge of modern gemology. So let's get into it. Vincent, if you're ready, come on in and we will get it going. Welcome.
Hello.
We almost didn't make it today. We were in the last moment, so that was excitement.
Yeah. We well, really at the last moment today. I hope that Emmanuel is still around, but we were nearly ready to say, "Oh, there was a problem today," and
we were just saying before we came on, we've been doing this already for more than 1 year, and we haven't had any problems. We never had to cancel the webinar. We had a couple of, someone showed up in the last 5 minutes because of some technical issue, but we have been lucky, and I guess the luck continues. We're not going to cancel today either.
But today again, it's not nothing with Emmanuel, because for the last half an hour he was trying to join the room. So I don't know exactly what happened in the Zoom setting, but well, we were able to see Emmanuel briefly about 30 seconds ago. So we hope that he will still be here, able to speak with us. That would be great.
So, give us a little background here before we get into the talk. So how do you and Emmanuel know each other?
Well, I first know about Emmanuel because I was reading a little bit about Gemmology with article and things like that. But the main reason I know about Emmanuel was because just after my studies at GIA, I started to work with AIGS. And I learned that there was a special course in Nantes University for people who were already gemmologists, on a special course in order to be a kind of bridge between classic gemmology, like you do in a normal gemmological school, and something more scientific, like a lab gemmology. And at this time, I was private buyer in Burma, and I was starting to collaborate with the AGS lab. And my boss at this time, Henry Ho, was thinking that in order, to be able to upgrade a little bit the lab, it could have been a great idea if me and another guy who was working in the lab, we could go to study with Emmanuel Fritsch in Nantes. So basically, I contacted Emmanuel, and we started to communicate about the possibility about doing a special class for the DUG, that is the name of the diploma, in English. And then within about 1 week, because Henry Ho had to go on a trip to Europe, the idea was to go to see the collection of Dr. Gobelin. We decided to combine this trip with a trip to Nantes. And I went with Henry Ho in Nantes, where I was able to meet Emmanuel. And we had a great day discussing about the possibility to make a DUG. And we were speaking about instrumentation in a laboratory and Raman and things like that. And we were able to meet also with Bernard Lanier, and who was in contact with Henry Ho and AIGS in the 1990s. And I found out at this time that AAGL was the first lab in the world to be equipped with a Raman. So we had a lot of discussion like that. But sadly, later, the DUG program didn't happen, and I was never able to go to study in Nantes, which is something that I miss a lot, and I really would have loved to go to study that class in Nantes. But then we keep in contact with Emmanuel, and I met a lot of his students, and we are in a very good relation since then.
Okay. So you mean the DUG didn't happen for you? It exists, though.
No, yeah, it didn't happen to me, but it exists, and I met many other people who studied there, and I only heard a positive thing about it. So this is something that if anybody wants to go beyond the classic, Gemmology class that you have everywhere, if you want to go to the next step, you're welcome to consider going in Nantes, which is a very nice city in the west of France, to study this DUG.
Okay. Well, I think we'll hear more about the DUG later because I have it in my list of questions that I want to talk about. But shall we invite Emmanuel in and let him tell it in his own way?
Sure.
Okay, Emmanuel, if you're ready, come on in. You can start your video, unmute, and show yourself to the world.
Hello. Do you see me?
We see you.
Yeah.
Welcome.
All right. Okay, I was making some comments actually on the chat line while you were talking. Because Vincent was actually, the do always happened. It's just that Vincent wanted to take it in English. Of course.
Okay.
And that was a problem at the time. They put in the chat. It was actually at the university, in French university, forbidden to teach in English, believe it or not. So that was a problem. And now that has changed. Has happened in English system. But just to let people know that it's no longer a problem, but it was a big administrative problem at the time we couldn't get around to. Yeah. Anyway, so hello everyone. Happy to be here.
Welcome.
And so
where are you calling from today?
Well, I'm from my office in my house. So that's very comfortable. I'm just at home.
Cool. Okay. Well, thanks for being here. So I guess we'll start off with our typical intro question and just tell us a little bit about who you are. For anybody, you and me have not met before, so I'd love to know more about you. And I'm sure some people in the audience would love to know more about who you are. And we'll get into a little bit of your story with the article and stuff like that.
Okay, well, I'm French. I was born and raised in France. And basically, I started really in Gemmology-related things during my Ph.D. I did my Ph.D. in the University of Paris-Jussieu for the good reason that I wanted to be close to the mineral collection, as big-time mineral collector at the time. I still am. And I wanted to do my PhD there because at the time, that's Pierre Marion, who was the curator, was a sort of a semi-god for me, and I wanted to meet this guy and be there. And so that's why I chose a PhD there specifically, because I didn't do a PhD in mineralogy, but on industrial glass, industrial silica glass. Funnily enough, the main topic of the PhD was parasitic colors in silica glass. There was a company making silica glass in France, and sometimes it came out brown instead of perfectly colorless, which it is supposed to be, or it came out pink, which was pretty but not intended, so that was not the right thing to do. And then we made very many other colors. But anyway, so that was also this PhD, my way to get introduced to origin of colors in materials. And of course, I immediately applied that to minerals because I was a big-time mineral collector. So I was in Jussieu. I did my PhD on silica glass, and I got hooked up pretty badly on Gemmology. Actually, I taught classes for what we called at the time third age university. You know, the old folks wanted to take some classes at the university. So that was about mineralogy and Gemmology, actually. Looking back, I tried to find my notes of these old days, but I think they've disappeared in my many moves. But that should be very interesting to see the kind of stupidity I might have said at the time. But anyway, things I would correct now. So that I really got involved into that. By the end of my PhD, I wanted to work in Gemmology. So things happen in a very indirect way. I sent, actually, for example, I sent a resume to GIA, who later hired me. Remember that. That resume was sent to Mr. Liddicoat, who said he was not interested, actually. But having worked doing my PhD with Gordon Brown at the time, or still actually is, a professor at Stanford University, Gordon, we kept friends. He said, well, what are you going to do after your PhD? So I told him, well, actually I had an opening in Mexico. So I said, maybe I'll go to Mexico. Oh, no, don't do that. You're going to waste all you've learned. I may have an idea for you. What I didn't know is that Gordon was on the board of governors of GIA at the time. So I got to GIA through that door after being told that they were not interested. So that's the way I got into GIA, actually, because Gordon was made it quite clear that it was a very good opportunity and all that. So that led to, but that was my candidature was looked at by a number of people, including George Rossman, a big name in the color of minerals. And one of the things I remember having read later on, George Rossman's letter to the board, George said, this guy looks good on paper. meaning maybe he's a nice guy, I don't know, but at least for the science, that's okay. So I really enjoyed that one. And we had good laugh at that, because later on, George and I became colleagues, but on the friendly side, really. And so I got into GIA that way. So I stayed there for nearly 10 years. I was their first postdoctoral student, which is what you do when you have a PhD and you want to go for a year or two some other place to see what's going on in different lab with different people, different methods, possibly also different language, which was the case for me because my English at the time was even rockier than it is now. And that was the intention. The intention was maybe a year or two. And then, there was Santa Monica, Southern California. After 6 months, they asked me if I wanted to stay. That was a difficult answer. I said yes. And didn't take too much reflection. And so I stayed on for 9 years. I had the pleasure of working with Jim Shigley, who was my boss, and became really a close friend. Also, John Koivula was there. So it was a small group of really great people, led Chuck Fryer, which I remember fondly as well. So it was a fun small group. The other member was Carol Stockton, that you may have seen the name of in James Gemmology and all that. So it's a small group of people deeply into Gemmology. So that's where I learned my Gemmology. I became a GG as a GIA employee. And I started to write an article about the origin of color in gems, because I already done an article about the origin of color in minerals during my PhD, which I just showed to Jim Shigley. We thought that was great. So he showed it to Alice Keller, who at the time was editor of Gems and Gemmology. And I said, we'll just translate the article. And I said, hey, wait, that's for minerals. That's not for gems. So let me adapt it and write it for gems with just gem examples, that sort of thing. And so that's what I did, and submitted to Gems and Gemmology. And to me, it seemed like there was no problem, really. Lo and behold, the article was refused by the referees. And it turned out, I can say that now because he's passed away, but it turned out that the main refusal came from Kurt Nassau. And he had written in the margin of a number of things, he had written, no, this is incorrect, without any further comment. So you couldn't really answer to that. And I sort of desperate, I didn't know what to do. And so I called George Rossman, who was already a long time associate of GIA. I said, well, here's the situation. I'm stuck. So I think that if you came in as a co-author, Kurt Nassau could not say no in the margin. And George was exemplary, and I said, oh no, I don't want to steal your thunder. I didn't know the expression at the time. I learned it from him in no circumstances. I said, what is he talking about thunder here? I don't understand. He didn't want to steal my thunder. So, but in the end, he accepted to do it, but he said, okay, let's rewrite it together. So I learned with George Rossman. I remember we did that on weekends. He would come to my little apartment in Culver City near the MGM studios, and we'll spend 2, 3, 4 hours and clean the article. And I took, in those 3, 4, 5 afternoons we spent together, I learned how to write an article from George Rossman. I remember how he was straight to the point, and no, this is the way you do it. Okay.
Was that was that the first article that you wrote in English, or had you written other English articles?
No, actually, for my PhD, I had written articles about parasitic coloration in silica glass, the thermal darkening of silica glass. So I had a limited experience, but already a bit. There was, for example, one article we couldn't understand. Why it was a short article, very much to the point, well structured, we thought, and the answer didn't come back. Well, it turned out that it was sent to a guy who had the good idea to pass away. And then so the article was blocked because the editor didn't want to call his wife and say, well, we need back the article. At the time, everything was done by paper, So, we had our fun writing articles. We had our fun. But no, that was not exactly my first. I had a little bit of experience writing in French and a little experience writing in English. And that's why I was a bit surprised I didn't go straight through the system, but that was Kurt that stopped it. And by the time we rewrote everything with George and we submitted, there was only minor correction, the normal stuff, I would say. Normal stuff. And so the article finally came out. So I stayed nearly 9 years with GIA, and then I sort of wanted to go further in the science, and I wasn't actually so much motivated by going back to France. That was not my first intent. My original intent was to go either work on synthetic diamond with General Electric, or there were interesting opportunities with DuPont de Nemours at the time, I thought. But it turned out that around that time, that in the US, there was a major cut on research financing by about 1/3. And so all these opportunities disappeared. But I had my friend Bernard Lanier, who had been studying something in Gemmology at Nantes University. I had visited him during my days at GIA, and just to see what's going on, basically. And Bernard told me, I'm getting to be 60. I need to have someone take over. There is perhaps a possibility we can have a university position at Nantes University. Would you like to come? I said, well, why not? Let's try that. So still in the US, applied for the position and got it. I mean, it was a long and complicated story. As Bernard Lanier used to put it, doors were opening in front of you and closing behind you. So it was just one of those conjunction of stars, in a sense, that made it possible for me to become a professor in France. And in that process, there was something rather funny. The question was I'm a geological engineer by trade. Actually, I did my studies in the geology school in Nancy, in east of France. Specialized in mining, actually, mining engineering. And so the question was, should I introduce myself as a geologist or a mining engineer, or should I pretend to be a physicist? Because all I did on the origin of color and that sort of thing, that's mostly physics. So I asked a bunch of people, including my former PhD advisor, and I got the same answer for everyone. He said, look at your list of publications. You are a physicist. Okay, so for that reason, and that reason only, now I'm a physics professor. I have no further qualification in physics, so don't tell anyone, please. But I'm a physics professor without any physics degrees. I learned it basically on the run. And but I'm still a geologist at heart, and that's why I like minerals. I still collect them. And for those who know me, they know that my collection, very early on, I figured that walking into a mineral show, I wanted to buy everything. So I said I have to specialize myself. And I specialize in not color, but twin crystals. I collect twin crystals. So if you have odd, unusual twin crystals, because I have most of the classics by now, I've been collecting for nearly 40 years now, so perhaps more actually. That's another topic of great interest to me.
Okay.
So in Nantes University, as Vincent said, I got involved with the Duke program. I'm now responsible for that. starting in 2017, we officially did it in English. And I would have liked to do that in 2019, 2020, but you know what happened. So people couldn't fly out. So hopefully next year we'll have a DUG in English again.
Cool.
And in the meantime, we have very small promotion all in French, because even in France, it was hard. At some point, you couldn't travel from one region to another. So it was pretty hard we use Zoom a lot for teaching and all that sort of thing. So here I am. That's what I've done. I'm a physics professor specialized in gem materials and interested in all aspects of gemology. I have written, I think it's in my ResearchGate thing, that my self-assigned mission is to get Gemmology more scientific. So that goes right with what Vincent said about the diploma being to try to teach a little bit of science and initiate people to scientific research within the field of Gemmology. So with like the horses, they have things to hide the side. That's exactly the thing that we do. We do material science, but only for gems.
So you're kind of opening up the blinders a little bit.
Well, just keeping it that way is hard enough. So, because you have to learn a lot of notions that belong to material science. So over the years, we have immensely improved the pedagogy, I think, to make it more attractive to people and more directly applicable and all that.
Yeah. But this is very useful, because the teaching in most of the Gemmological school don't have changed a lot for the past 50 years, but Gemmology has had a lot of evolution for the past 50 years.
Yes, and we've tried to actually help that. I was asked by the French Union for Jewelry who actually now owns the French Gemmological Labs, to initiate a classical Gemmology program. So you do whatever you want. So we started with whatever was available already, but we added things like, for example, in the last 20 years, lots of people had talked about magnetism of gems. And there are very simple things you can do with a hand magnet, for example, to separate for rough, for example. And so this sort of thing we've tried to introduce, and also introduce more scientific notion, keeping the jargon way down, but just making it more accurate from a scientific point of view. So that's what I've been doing for the past, I don't know how long the diploma has been on, but at least 5 years now, I think.
Cool.
What I tell most of the time to people who want to study the DUG, they say, but if I don't want to work in a gem lab, will it be useful? I say yes, because if you go, you will be able to read articles about Gemmology, like in Gemmology and things like that, because you will learn about spectroscopy, UVVs, FTR, EDXRF, Raman, and things like that. So you will be able to understand what it's written about in these articles.
And it's not only the techniques, it's also the scientific method that you're going to learn. And so people find it useful not just to be lab gemologists, also to become experts, because as an expert, even if you don't have a lab or have a very small lab, and you're an expert in jewelry, for example, part of being an expert in jewelry is being able to determine the stones precisely. And for that, you have to use first the proper instrumentation, which you learn in classical Gemmology, but then you have to go further as an expert. You have to be able to get yourself out of sticky situation, like we all know the difficulties of sometimes identifying stones that are mounted. And there are little tricks that you can learn from classical Gemmology. That's where being able to say whether you have a uniaxial or a biaxial, or and the sign may help a bit, or get yourself out of a tight spot using pleochorism, or this, or luminescence, UV luminescence, which is in my view underused. Sorry, that's another one of my pet peeves, actually, UV luminescence. So you may get a bit of that even if you don't ask for it. But there are many ways you can use better classical Gemmology, and that also you learn in the DUG. Actually, I start with the classical Gemmology quiz, and I'll reveal one of my questions today. And if we think about it, we might give the answer by the end of the talk, but what are the two inclusions you find in Birol and only in Birol?
Okay.
There are two inclusions you'll see only in beryl, two types of inclusion.
So if
and
anybody...
in no other gem. So if you see them in a microscope, and here I pay a little homage, by the way, to John Koivula, who had a fantastic seminar. It was called Microscope Only Identification. And so you only looked at inclusion or color zoning or patterns you could see under the microscope, and you had to say which gem that was. That's a fantastic seminar that he had put together. I learned actually these tricks from him. So hello, John, if you listen. But so there are two inclusions that are found in beryl and no other gem. And I'll leave it at that for the moment.
Okay. Well,
Justin, you may want to take a note so we deliver people from the...
Okay, so if anyone wants to guess, they can guess in the chat, and I'll keep track, and we'll
Absolutely. That's a good idea. Absolutely.
Okay. So yeah, we'll come back to the DUG later. Let's talk a little bit about the article that we are here for tonight. So tell us a little bit about, for anyone who hasn't read it, of course, shame on them, but tell us a little bit about what the article is about, and we can get into how you made it and the idea behind it.
Yeah, that's an article that's a very long career, because I started out from my interest in color that came from the parasitic coloration in glass, and of course applied immediately to minerals. So started collecting information on that, writing an article in French, as I said. And so basically, I started to realize that there are multiple causes of color, and you need to sort of organize them in a logical way if you want to present that. So there are not too many different ways you can do. There were already reviews articles about origin of color in minerals and things like that, but they were older or they were shorter. And I was allowed lots of room with gems and Gemmology, so actually, the article came out in 3 parts, if I remember correctly.
Correct.
Yeah, and 4 in French, actually, because I just, a huge table at the end, I updated for the French version later on, 10 years later. And so the huge table of origin of color. So actually, basically, in the article, what we first explain is what causes color, first of all, in any material. So the cause of color could be absorption. That's the most common one. And basically, that means that the material would be a gem or anything else, is absorbing some of the visible light. And therefore, what comes to your eye is still visible light, but with some colors missing, some wavelengths missing, or some energies missing. So actually, it's colored. And that's because you took out of the rainbow, basically, partially some of the colors, and you end up with a colored light coming into your eye. So for example, if the super classical case of ruby, it absorbs the green, and therefore it's red. It's a little more complicated than that, but for the time being, that'll be enough. And on the contrary, for peridot, for example, which is green, where the red is hugely absorbed, and then there are absorption also on the violet and blue side, which are due to slightly different causes. And all of that gives you
greenstone,
a very narrow, what we call a transmission window. That is the colors that you see, the wavelengths that get to your eye, that gives the color to the gem. So this is a very generic thing. Mostly it's absorption. Another thing that is often forgotten is actually what is called physical colors. For lack of a better term, because all colors are physical in a way, but by opposition to chemical colors due to impurity, I suppose. For example, if you look at Vincent's magnificent white beard, the white color that you see in many, many gems or matrix of gems is actually due to scattering of light, meaning that you have one material. You have actually to have scattering of light, you have to have two materials. You have to have a matrix material, and in that material, you have to have another one. So there, in his beard, in the hair, actually, you have it's hollow, and you have hair and hair. So it's a game on pronunciation. You have the protein, and you have the hollow space, which is air, and they have different index of refraction. Therefore, light goes through them, changing direction, and basically all that light come back to your eye without being absorbed. That's why you see white. no wavelength is missing, no color is missing, it's just recomposed, but it's white now because all the rays goes in different directions, so it's all blurred, and you don't see it transparent anymore, but just white. So that's a very common thing, to see white, but in gems, we have also things like moonstone, which is blue due to light scattering. So that's another possible origin of color. That's a much less common. We have diffraction, of course, it belongs to that same category for opal and a number of other material. And then you have tiny origins of color, things that are, for example, there are still a lot of material, gem materials, colored by their inclusions. Yeah. Opal, for example, or most silicas are colored by their inclusions. It's not that the silica is colored, that's the inclusion is colored, actually. So that's true, for example, for agate or opals, common opals. And yet another process that can give color is fluorescence. Now we think, oh, that's a rare case. Well, yes and no. For example, in ruby, I did describe the fact that you have green being absorbed, therefore red being transmitted. But there is something else. This green being absorbed is a lot of energy that the gem has taken inside it. And it can restore part of that energy, a lesser amount, therefore at higher wavelengths, therefore in red instead of the green. It can restore part of that energy as visible light. So it turns out that ruby, sort of an overkill in terms of origin of color in gems, is red due to absorption, but if you consider absorption only, it should be actually purplish red. When it gets to be really red, it's because you have a contribution from luminescence. And that's basically part of what is generally accepted now, the definition of the pigeon blood ruby. I hate these terms, but when you have these really bright red rubies, it's because luminescence is part of it, and they are acting in part as sources of light. So that's another possibility. I was just finishing this morning a presentation from Zacatecas University in Mexico. They asked me to do a bit on, they have a fantastic hyalite opal that came out in 2014, I studied, and which is colored green by uranium luminescence. So it's yellow body color, but green luminescence also colors the gem, so it's highly valuable. And you have a similar phenomenon, not with uranium, but that happens in diamond, what they call the green emitters, formerly called the green transmitters, but they are really emitters, they should be called emitters, and so on and so forth. So you have various possibilities for origin of color, the most common one being absorption. And for absorption, you have at least three big categories, where you have isolated metal ions. When we say that emerald or ruby is colored by chromium, that's it. And you have chromium that can act, you have vanadium. Titanium by itself doesn't get very many color in gemstones, but manganese, iron, cobalt, nickel, copper, these are the, and iron I cited, I think, are very important players in the game of color. So that's a huge amount of colors you see in gems or other materials, as a matter of fact, it's not limited to gems. But once you have gone through the vast numbers of gems that are colored by trace metal ions, then you get into the little more complicated phenomenon. So I ordered them in the article by size. Say there are things that are absorbing that are not dispersed metal ions, but can be the size of an atom or two atoms and sometimes much bigger. These are called color centers. And whenever I talk about color centers, I like to make the parallel with Venus de Milo in Louvre in Paris. Venus de Milo is that Greek statue which has no arms. And everybody admires it. And I'm always wondering if it had its arms actually still on, it'd be that much admired. I don't think so. So basically, the Venus de Milo, what makes it attractive is its defects. Well, there's a very same thing happening with gems. Gems are usually single crystals. Single crystals are never, ever perfect. Remember that. people tell you diamond, it's perfectly like, no. There are always a large amount of defects in there. But large actually ends up being concentration like the part per million. So you have an atom, which is a defect or a problem, compared to a million atoms that are doing exactly what they are supposed to do. So it seems like it's very small, but actually it induces very efficiently color. And you have gazillions of examples of color centers, most of which are still unknown. To give you an example with diamond, which is colored often by color centers, there are hundreds of color centers that are listed in the book, actually. Mm-hmm. And out of those, there are probably 20, 30, we really know what they are. And the others, we have an idea. Oh, this one is related to nickel. Oh, this one might be related to hydrogen. Oh, this one you need to have nitrogen and hydrogen to get that one. But that's it. You don't really know the exact nature of the defect. So it's very often the case in colored stones. And there is a really a full transition with isolated metal ions. Because, for example, if you consider pink tourmalines, so you can say they are colored by manganese 3+. Okay. But actually, in nature, obtaining directly manganese 3+ doesn't happen generally. Generally, the manganese is 2+. And guess what? When you have those beautiful pink tourmalines from pegmatites around the world, they started their life colorless. Because one forgets that most gems are actually colorless when they are pure. They gain color by either adjunction of impurities, iron, chromium, whatever, or defects. Okay, so going back to our pink tourmalines, now they grow colorless with a small amount of manganese 2+, say something around 1%. Mm-hmm. But manganese 2+ absorb, for manganese 2+ to give a color, you have to have several percent of manganese 2+. So for example, that rhodochrosite is colored by manganese 2+, but then manganese 2+ is part of the formula of rhodochrosite, meaning there are large amounts of manganese in there. In tourmaline, that's not the case. In tourmaline, you have only a tiny amount of manganese. And it's 2+, and it doesn't really absorb very much. So essentially, the tourmaline, when it grows, it's colorless. And that would be acorite, as the variety name goes. But then what happens? It's in pegmatite. In pegmatite, you have things that are radioactive. Mm-hmm. So over very long period of time, and it was measured, I think, in the Himalaya mine by the team of George Rossman, and I think Eileen Reinitz also from GIA New York was part of that game at the time, that it takes about 100,000 years to turn, at least in the Himalaya mine environment, to turn a colorless tourmaline pink. And that's what happens for most pink tourmalines around the world. I don't believe any of them grows with manganese 3+, it's manganese 2+, followed by natural irradiation. So, is that coloration by a trace amount of metal, or is that a color center induced by irradiation? Because the term color centers was originally given to defects caused by irradiation. Mm-hmm. So actually, in that case, you do one or the other. It depends from which angle you look at it. So color centers are very important, but they are hell for people like me trying to understand the origin of color. It's very difficult to understand a color center. With much pain and the help of a friend with a theoretical chemist, well, a couple of friends that are theoretical chemists, we managed to find a structure of the only color centers coloring diamond related to hydrogen that is actually, we know the structure of. I mean, there are probably dozen others, but that's the only one for which we have a structure. So it's a long effort, and it's very difficult to understand the origin, the structure, the atomic structure of a color center. You can get pretty close and say, oh, well, it's probably related to an oxygen vacancy, for example. That's what I call the usual suspects in oxide. You've seen that movie, Usual Suspects. Well, here it's the same. You have usual suspects for color centers. In oxides, well, of course, if you kick out an oxygen atom, which will inevitably happen either during growth or by irradiation, or perhaps even deformation, you may have a color center being created. So But then you can say, well, it's an oxygen vacancy, but that's it. You can't go very much further, you know. And it's very difficult to prove, actually, that you have an oxygen vacancy, to visualize it by one method or another. So color centers is a category upon itself. Hell for the people trying to understand them. Sometimes you just get lucky. You get strong pleochroism or something like that. And so it gives you a hint of what to look for. But most of the time, very difficult. Then after that, you have another category that involves several atoms, which is the charge transfer. Charge transfer means that you don't have an isolated atom like you had originally, for example, your chromium 3+. Everything happens, the absorption happens entirely within the chromium 3+ ion. So it operates on its own. Okay. Now for charge transfer, that's a different story. You need to have several atoms pulling together, in a sense, to absorb visible light. So how is it done? Well, they have their orbitals sort of in common, covering each other, which by definition means that they make a molecule. And that molecule could be, you have, for example, a charge transfer, which is very important in Gemmology, which is the oxygen to minus ion 3+ charge transfer. This is not the isolated ion 3+. You have to have the ion 3+ and at least one oxygen involved in the process. And that will give you that huge absorption in UV, which actually kills luminescence when you have too much ion in many minerals and gems. And when you have a lot of it, also it can give you a yellow color because it is in the UV, the maximum in the UV, but then the foot of it, as we say in spectroscopy, the foot of the absorption gets into the violet and the blue. So that'll generate the color that's opposite to violet and blue, if nothing else is present. And so that'll give you yellow. And but do we know many iron-colored minerals that are yellow? Classic example being orthoclase, yellow orthoclase colored by iron 3+. Anyway, so the charge transfer is a big deal. We talked about the one with oxygen, but you can have also the very famous one, which is iron titanium, which gives the blue color to sapphire. And everybody says, oh yeah, that's iron titanium's charge transfer. But if you talk to the people, really look into these things in detail, you'll realize that, yeah, it involves iron titanium, but there are a few things that don't exactly match too well. And it's funny because preparing this talk, we talked about iron titanium charge transfer, and I had recently correspondence with Brendan Lors, the editor of Journal of Gemmology, formerly Gems and Gemmology, but now Journal of Gemmology. And he was telling me that regarding iron titanium charge transfer, George Rossman and I independently had been trying to find funding to study that from a theoretical point of view, because there is a thing we don't understand terribly well. You know, iron titanium gives a blue color to sapphire. They say they give the blue color to benitoite, but there's absolutely no proof of that. They say they give the blue color to kyanite. There may be a little better proof, but not definitive of that. But then in many minerals and gems, it actually doesn't give a blue color at all. It absorbs, it's a continuum absorption that rises toward the UV. It gives you, for example, the yellow to orange to black color of some garnets. Actually, it participates to the color of garnet in that way. And so why in one case you have nearly a continuum or very strong absorption in UV, why in another case in the middle of the visible, where is such a variation of iron titanium charge transfer throughout the various minerals? It's also what colors andalusite. So there are criteria actually to recognize those charge transfer. Usually they are very directional because they are along the iron titanium axis. So that makes a very strong direction. So when you have one characteristic of light, we call the electrical vector, which is basically the direction of vibration of light, but we don't need to get too deep in the physics. When you have the electrical vector that's along the iron titanium axis, then you have very strong absorption. When it's perpendicular, you have really nearly no absorption. So that gives you a very strong pleochroism. And you find that in many minerals colored by iron 2+, iron 3+, or iron titanium charge transfer. The other characteristic of that is the absorption is very broad, meaning it's a strong coloring agent because it absorbs a lot of the visible light, therefore colors strongly. And so there are other more physical characteristics we don't need to get into the details of, but certainly iron titanium has all the right characteristics to be a charge transfer. Nevertheless, there are some details that don't seem to fit so well, and we would like to have a more general picture of that. So that's enough for charge transfer, which are a pretty big deal in the origin of some gems. Blue sapphire coming far ahead of everybody there. Then you have other phenomena that involve several atoms, actually. But, for example, the reinforcement of absorption in indicolite tourmaline. The absorption is essentially due to iron 2+, but actually it's unusually strong for an isolated iron 2+. So the iron 2+ is not fully isolated in there. The iron 2+, in a way, speak to one another. And there is strengthening of the absorption due to that. They do things together. You have other examples also of similar phenomena with iron 3+ iron. When they see each other, they may have even magnetic interaction, the iron 3+ being a magnetic ion, so that also enhances the strength of absorption and makes for special cases, you can't really interpret that just as a charge transfer or just as an isolated ion. The ions are not isolated. They see each other in a sense, they influence each other in a more correct way to say it. And so we have a number of phenomena in gems that are like that, which are not exactly charge transfer, but involve groups of atoms, all the way to an intermediate in a way between groups of atoms and inclusions. The best example I know of that is, those feldspar from Oregon, sunstone from Oregon, and some are red and some are green and some are zoned and some have copper crystals that actually give an aventurescence to them. And so you're wondering, what's going on in here. So clearly you have copper because you can see it as an inclusion. But then the red is usually isotropic, the green isn't. And you're wondering what's going on. And that was made more clear by a recent Ph.D. in Wuhan University in China with my friend Andy Shen, and they demonstrated the role of actually nano inclusion. So it's, in a sense, inclusion coloration. In other words, it's just another way of absorbing light, which is very strange and happens only with nanoparticles. And so what you have is you have very small copper precipitates, say something like 200 nanometer. So that's even smaller than a visible, than the wavelengths of visible light, 200 nanometer. Remember, visible light is roughly 400, 700 nanometers. Now we're talking 200, so it's very small. But it has a special way of absorbing the light super efficiently. And that gives you a very broad absorption that's responsible for the red color, which is nearly isotropic because these precipitates of copper are nearly spherical. So whichever direction you look at them, they absorb the light in the same way. Now for the green one, it's fun. For the green one, you don't have spheres, you have rods. They are elongated. So if you look down the rod, it's as if you have a sphere, so it's like red. If you look with the rod in that direction, compared to the electrical vector, then you have a different absorption because it's a different shape simply of nanoparticle, and that absorbs the red now and gives you the green color. So you see there is a whole range of possibilities. That one, by the way, is a recent discovery, so it wasn't in the original article, so I cheated a little bit, but because, of course, there have been discoveries. I mean, the article was published in the late 80s. So since the late 80s, thank God, there have been some progress about the origin of color in gems.
Let's hope.
So I hope you won't be offended by the fact that I cite more recent research. So that's about what was in the original article. I encourage you to read. By and large, everything written in there is still correct, but there are many additions that need to be made. I don't think Paribas tourmalines are in there. I don't remember, but I don't think Paribas tourmalines are in there, copper tourmalines or Cuprian tourmalines. So that's one big modification that need to be made, and there are many other origin of colors that have been understood since there, or elucidated, as Edward Goblin would say. He uses very much that verb elucidated, which I think is very nice and changes a bit from the usual words, oh, we understand that now, or we discovered the cause, or what we elucidated. Isn't that beautiful?
Yeah.
Okay. So that's for the article.
Yeah, no, that's great. I mean, I feel like you just gave me a crash refresher on all the things that I forgot in gemology school. That I need to know, because I've been writing a lot about color from the point of view of the gem cutter. We obviously we're thinking about color and controlling the color. So you just put a lot of questions into my mind, though. One of the things that I know as a gem cutter is that when stones are colored through absorption, we can control a little bit of the absorption by the light path length, by the faceting pattern. So
Absolutely.
but now I'm thinking about, maybe there's so many examples I didn't think about because I wasn't thinking about other kinds of coloring sources, like you said, physical colors and diffractions and everything. So, from the gem cutter point of view, if stones are being colored in other ways besides absorption, are there ways that we can affect them? I don't mean with treatments, but I just mean through cutting.
No, by cutting, yeah. Well, for example, if you take the example of light scattering in moonstone, in the beautiful moonstones, very blue from Eliagoda, for example, in Sri Lanka, you've noticed that the phenomenon appears in one direction only. So again, as with absorption, we have a non-isotropic mineral, you do have to control the direction in which you will cut, generally a cab actually, for this. So the physical phenomena don't appear at random generally. They don't create colors at random. They are usually due to structure, or what we call sometimes in material science textures, meaning you have two materials inside one another, like in the moonstone, that's two separate feldspar. There is one that precipitates in the other one. So these kind of textures actually are usually some degree of crystallographic control, just like absorption in non-isotropic minerals. So you do need to take care of orientation. When you cut opals, for example, you have to be very attentive to which direction will provide the best play of color, because you have play of color in all directions, but usually you know what the markets really want, and you're going to try to get out of that piece of rough the best possible play of color. So that's very much related to the texture within the opal, and which orientations are the stacking over spheres and their sizes and so on and so forth, and the various patches and all that. So for the example of Gim on the feldspar, you have to be very careful with that. If you want to have the green color, you have to cut it in the right orientation. Otherwise, you'll mix the green and the red, which has been done for fun. That's a gem for gemologists. But so we have a French friend, Emmanuel, another Emmanuel, who does cut these kind of things, and sometimes he cuts them with a maximum pleochroism, because it's not exactly pretty, but gemologists love it. So he does a few stones for France, usually. Yeah. But usually you'll cut it either in the red, which is rather isotropic, so that's not so difficult, or the green direction, but not somewhere in between, because that'd be not so attractive. So yes, the work of the lapidary, I think, is often underestimated, because they have to take into account a lot of parameters. And you were evoking, for example, the fact that you can more or less darken the stone by making the pass length inside the stone longer. For example, if you have a thick girdle compared to a thin girdle. Mm-hmm. I've seen a beautiful example of that on a red diamond that could have been a pink diamond if the diamantaire, or the lapidary, because they are just lapidaries working only one gem, hadn't been a bit clever, and he put a super thick
girdle.
I forgot the word girdle. He put a super thick girdle, and that was just enough to bring it from a fancy intense purplish pink to red.
That's purplish red. That's
and so or you have this classical example. I often admire that in some vivid yellow diamond, but you have the exact same thing in blue sapphire. These rough are often very zoned. And when you have a smart lapidary, he puts the color at the very bottom of the cullet. And then you may have just the cullet area that is colored, and the rest is colorless, which makes for very luminous stones, by the way. but they are blue only if you look at them straight direction. Otherwise, you see they are partly colored.
Yeah.
You have the very same with type 1b natural diamonds. We tend to have a zoning between near colorless and bright yellow, and putting the bright yellow just by the very point of the pavilion makes it a beautiful stone, very luminous again. And so I think, I mean, the work of the lapidary is often underestimated, but I've been on when I studied at GIA, the secretary of the department was Pat Gray, Mike Gray's wife, and Mike Gray is very well known as a gemstone cutter in the US. So very quickly, I got initiated to the little mysteries and the secrets of lapidaries by the Gray family there. And hello to them if they're watching, by the way. And I have a lot of respect for the work of the lapidary because I know it's not so easy.
Yeah.
And by the way, I even took a class when I was at GIA of gemstone cutting, and that was a lesson in humility. So
Oh, wow.
I did manage to cut a few stones, but you realize that it's not so easy as it seems.
Yeah. Well, so I'm also wondering, so you're saying that inside of the category of absorption as a color source, there's 3 different ways that colors can be absorbed, or 3 different causes. From my
at least,
yeah. So from my gem cutter point of view, do I need to think about that as far as what I'm doing, or absorption is absorption as far as I'm concerned?
Well, you need to think about it in terms of orienting the color in the right direction. And sometimes it's already very difficult because you have to make really cruel choices. I remember seeing a 40-carat alexandrite, which was cut in absolutely the wrong direction, to look at the color change. The color change in alexandrite is very directional. It's not very well known, but it's very directional. And actually, you could see the color change from the side of the stone, not from face up. But I understand, in a sense, what happened to the lapidary was there. Boy, I can make a 40-carat alexandrite. And if he had cut it right, he would have cut perhaps 2, 10, or 15 carat at the most alexandrite. So it's a very cruel game sometimes, I think.
Yeah.
But in terms of absorption, usually it's just that, being careful with the orientation and making sure and not hesitate to lose some weight to get a much more beautiful stone. In the end, usually, I'm not saying it's always true, but usually it ends up paying when you look at the final price per carat.
No, I agree. Totally agree.
Yeah.
Okay, well, there's tons of questions from the audience here, so let's.
Already, I haven't had time to read all of that. Actually,
I'll present them to you. So we'll do a few from here, and then we'll go back, and I've got some more questions for you as well. But first question comes from Mubashir Mansour. So he is always an author of great questions on this show. So he says, given the uncertainties in the source of color in many gems which get their color from defects, what is your opinion on the application and potentials of density functional theory and ab initio calculations in Gemmology for answering these questions?
So for the non-initiated, because this is highly technical, density functional theory, DFT, that's the new star, in a sense, in theoretical chemistry. That's a new type of calculations, and they keep improving on it. And we have someone in our lab who is very good at it and has many students, and they do a lot of calculations for us. We've done recently, for example, calculation on solite, because we have been studying acmanite. So yes, indeed, we need more help from those people. The fact is, in the gem world, to get those people, you have to understand that they are very much in demand from all fields of physics and chemistry. Basically, all my colleagues want to work with theoreticians, and all of them work with them. So basically, they are in high demand. How do you convince them to work on gems? That's a good question. But yes, there is a great future for DFT, theoretical calculation. We need more theoreticians. We need more people who can do DFT on gems and apply the new variations of DFT and the ab initio calculations, because really talking about color centers, I need to go into the details, but since this is mentioned in the question, first of all, you have to figure a structure that be stable in mineral. For example, the one we worked on for hydrogen in diamond, we knew there got to be some color centers involving in diamond. But a lot of what we saw, we thought there would be a couple nitrogen atoms and the hydrogen atoms. Now, how do you stick that in a diamond structure? You have no way of trying yourself. All you do is this kind of ab initio calculation. You put these things in a box, you stick them in a diamond structure, and you wait and see which one is the most stable. So actually, they've iterating calculations, and what you're looking at is formation energy. And the smallest the formation energy, the less likely they are to be formed. So if you have like a formation energy that's 10 EVs, forget it. It's unlikely to form. If you have a formation energy of 1.5 EV, that's much more likely, and so on and so forth. So actually, I remember on that particular center that was using DFT, but a special variation of it that's been adapted to strictly the diamond structure. That's the MPRO program for the aficionados in there, if there are any, by the way. So what they were doing is they were calculating various structures. Various structures appear being possible. Then you have to calculate the formation energy. They are like kids, actually, between the two theoreticians. Oh, I have one as 2.75 EV, and then several hours later, another man, oh, I got 250, beat you, and so on and so forth. So they were very active for a couple, 3 days like that, first determining which structure was the most stable, possibly. So they finally got together, they agreed on a particular structure. And once you have that structure, you have to find how it may absorb visible light. And that's another game, entirely different game, actually. So that's only recently, with all the improvement in the speed of computers, and that we are able to do such complicated calculation. And you can even do, and we do that in our team, calculations, not just the absorption, but also the luminescence, even if it has a vibronic component that is, if it's coupled with vibrations or lattice, which complicates matters in a sense. And now we get very good results. But to do that, for example, at the Institute, we have what we call logical cores. That is basically one computer, if you will. We have an association of 400 computers, and there are large companies who have clusters where you have like 4,000 or 8,000 or 10,000 computers. So you rent time or you find money to buy time on these things. And it's you have to realize that one calculation, like the center I took as an example in diamond, that may be 1,000 hours of calculations. Mm. So 1,000 hours, that's a hell of a lot of time. So you have to have funding for that. So one of the big problem with applying theoretical chemistry to gemmology is finding the money. So Vincent has already heard my get on my soapbox and say that we need funding for research in gemmology. But if you want to understand the origin of color, for example, in brown diamond was a mystery. It's a perfect example of how you got to know approximately what's involved in the defect, and then with much more effort, you finally understand what the defect really is. Because we knew, for a very long time, we knew that brown coloration in most diamond was caused by plastic deformation. So that's, so you put a name on something, but you say, okay, well, plastic deformation, so what does it do actually exactly inside the stone? Well, no answer. Then the high pressure, high temperature treatment of diamond came about. People were taking brown Tin 2A diamonds and turning them into near colorless diamond. So that grabbed the attentions of the De Beers and many others who have powerful research associates. And they decided they're going to find out for good what's causing the color in brown diamond. So once the hunt was on and the money was flowing, that still took a couple, 3 years. I don't remember if it was 2 or 3 years, but it took a couple of years at least before we could find out, using a very far out, little known technique called positron annihilation, that actually very classical thing that happens when you deform a material, you create vacancies. And vacancies are definitely color centers, but they don't necessarily absorb in the visible range. So here what was happening is you had lots of vacancies created by the deformation, but they were diffusing like you diffuse beryllium or titanium in corundum, they were diffusing, they were moving inside the crystal and getting grouped and making a cluster. And when you have 30 to 60 vacancies, that's the defect that's responsible for the brown color of diamond. But that was 2 to 3 years of very difficult work, going in one direction to start with their entire PhDs, looking, for example, at dislocations in diamond, trying to find out if it was a link to dislocations. Well, I mean, the efforts were not lost. We learned something about dislocation in diamond, but we didn't find the origin of brown color, which was the ultimate goal. So we finally got the sacred graal, if you will, 2-3 years later with these experiments demonstrating there was positron annihilation, and everybody then wondered, why don't we see them with the transmission electron microscope? If they are like big holes like that, I mean, that's big hole, that's 60 atoms missing together, So that's a void inside the structure. So you're like, hey, how didn't you see that with a transmission electron microscope? Is that possible? There's a lady in Germany who had done, Ulrich Banger, something like that. She had done lots of work on that. And, she was almost vexed, actually, having done all that amount of work, that she wasn't able to see these things. But then, once you know what you're looking for, it's a lot easier to find it. So actually, the next year, she came by and showed us pictures with a transmission electron microscope of those vacancies. And lo and behold, you know what was going on, why they never saw that, because when you're a microscopist, and everybody who's taken pictures of inclusion in gems knows what I'm talking about, you make sure everything is in focus, right? You make sure it's sharp, everything is in focus. Well, if you try that on a cluster of 60 vacancies with an electron microscope on diamonds, it doesn't work. What you have to do is to systematically defocus. So when you defocus, and you don't have to defocus a little, you have to defocus a hell of a lot. And then all of a sudden, you have sort of light cloud that appears in the picture, which is the much awaited vacancy cluster. So you see, I mean, it's not so easy to get to understand. That's one color center. Remember, it's just one color center.
Wow.
Years of effort for a whole bunch of various people in different universities, finally getting it for something that was in the end relatively simple.
So this is like mysteries of the universe being unveiled.
That's more or less, yeah.
There is a bias of the spectroscopy of the person who take inclusion photography just want to get everything in focus, and then okay, that's blurry.
Yeah, but that's the wrong thing to do in this particular case. And remember, we still don't know. Now we know what's causing brown coloration in diamond. That's brown graining. We do have pink graining in diamond and the pink diamonds, and that we still don't know what it is. I mean, Louis Gaillou did some work on that, showing there's a lot of micro-twinning in there, but sorry, how do you go from micro-twinning to absorption of visible range? We haven't figured that out yet.
Actually, there are many stones we still don't really know where the color is coming from.
Absolutely. Everything that's mostly is colored by color centers.
Many. The more you...
Blue topaz. Take blue topaz.
Yeah, what is great with your article is when I was a young gemologist and I was searching for that, at least you have a crash course on what we know, and still, we start to feel about, here we don't really know, and then you see all the rest and you say, wow, okay, that will be cool.
If you look at, I think I published somewhere a list of colors in diamond and their origin, and in there you see a lot of unknown defect. Well, it's a defect, but we don't know which one. Sorry about that.
But Emmanuel, why did you get interested in this topic about color in gems? What was your
figure? I mean, it comes from several directions, I think. First of all, I was always interested in gems. And although I have a mining engineer, I love mines, I get to mines anytime I get a chance. My mom, when I was involved in Gemmology, my mom reminded me kindly that when I was little, and she'll go to the shopping center, she could leave me alone in front of a jewelry store, and I would stay there very calmly looking at the jewels for 15 minutes or whatever, and she had time to go shopping and buy coffee or whatever. So I think that there is in me some attraction for short gems or jewelry or whatever, which was there to start with. The color, I think that came because as a mineral collector, if you are semi-curious, you can't just look at minerals and say, oh, they have pretty colors, and I have absolutely no interest in understanding what the origin of color would be. You know what I mean? That means you'd be pretty stupid, I think. So I think everybody looking at the bright colors of certain minerals is like, wow, but what's the cause of that? And so I got interested in that, and then immediately, due to my PhD topic, I had the instruments necessary to understand that in glass, which is not any easier, by the way, than doing it on minerals. So I combined the two, and I got something I really had interested in, understanding the color of minerals. And as you know, it's really important when you gemology, because if you want to understand the treatments, irradiation, heat treatment, diffusion, whatever, and then you have to understand actually the origin of color.
Yep.
And the origin of color actually is the first step to another pet subject of mine, which is the origin of luminescence. You have to have first absorption of light to after be able to turn that light into visible light again through the gem. So that's the process number 2 in a way. If process number 1 is the absorption. So for all these reasons, over the years, I really got interested in the subject, and there is a lot of material I still need exploring. There is a fair amount, there is a small amount, of unpublished data, and then I'll directly accuse George Rossman every time I get into his office, tell him, why didn't you publish that? You know, he has all this project neatly ordered with binders, and so every time I get into his office, I take the blue topaz binder, I take it from the back and put it in the front. But it's been totally unsuccessful at the moment. George publishes whatever he wants and doesn't care a bit about what I'm telling him.
I just want to be 200% sure about everything.
Yeah, at least 100%. If he's only 99, he doesn't publish. So that's good in a sense, but bad in the other, because there's so much that he has already established that if he doesn't publish it, he will disappear. And that's the thing I fear. He's done an enormous amount of work on the blue topaz, for example, but more recently he's done a lot of work on benitoite, or because of course that's California gemstone. He's in California. He has lots of people. He's friends with many miners, many dealers, and all that. So he's done lots, and very little is published. But that being said, after more than 30 years of career, I'm a little bit the same, actually. I have articles that I have written have not been published, so I don't accuse him of everything, but I'd like him to see him publish a little more of the stuff.
If you check inside my computer, you see on the researcher thing, you have about 50% of the folders that are unpublished. It's
well, that's
unfinished business, working on a progress, because they start to. It's the same. About 50% is.
See, the best way to get going is get an incentive. I do that occasionally from with Brendan Lors from Journal of Gemmology. He calls me up. He says, well, how about this subject? We talked about in Tucson. Do you still have the sample? Yeah, the sample. Did you work on? Oh, yeah, I worked on them. Oh, yeah. And what did you find? Well, I found that. But so why don't you publish a gem note on it? It's not that big an effort, 6 hours. Okay. And so that's how it gets published in the end, because someone kicks you in the butt and tells you, get going, please. And but a lot still doesn't get published. I try to avoid that with my students. I try that they all publish what they're doing. It's easy when you're a student because you have few topics.
This is one of the interesting points with the DUG, is that at the end of the DUG, you first the students, they get familiar with the instrument, and then basically you teach them how to write a report, make a publication. And I heard a lot about how tough you are with the bibliography, which is very good, because when I take somebody in the field, I tell to them, before the field, you are supposed to have written the introduction, and you are supposed to have written the bibliography already. So when I go on the
that's true.
Sometimes I ask them the thing, and I see they have done nothing. Then I say, what is going on here?
Yeah.
No bibliography.
Well, it's something people don't understand, but the big problem with PhD students is usually a PhD 3 years in France, and they start writing in the third year, and usually only 6 months before the end. And so it's a big problem. You have the big shock of having a white page in front of you, and then you have to write. And so I tell them, once you have your topic, you can start to write the introduction, because that's the motivation of what you did. You can start to write materials and methods, start describing your sample and the techniques you're going to use. And then you can write the famous bibliography. And I'm a little bit tough on the bibliography because students don't generally understand why it's so important. Bibliography is the only thing you have in the article that allows you to go back to former articles where you find far more details that you can give in one article. You're not going to copy simply an old article to make a new one. So you have to be able to locate this old article, and writing correctly the bibliographic reference is very important. But that's a message, every year I try to improve my class on that. I try to improve the documents I give the student on that, but I must say some do it well, but not everybody. But it's a very important part of research is bibliography. So now in the DUG, we have to first write a bibliographic report, which is just an exercise. So at least they do the whole cycle once, at least on the bibliography.
I heard about
and then you have to write the experimental report. And all that, of course, is on topics chosen with a student on things that they are motivated by, because that's work they do on top of everything else. So you need to have motivated students to get through all this work. But anyway, no, it's important to write reports, and some DUGs have evolved into scientific articles. For example, Thomas Heinz-Frank DUG turned into an article, these sort of things. We had a recent DUG, actually, he actually established a record because that's only recent, that's in the last 5 years that we have had this structure with bibliographic reports and experimental reports. Well, this guy, he was already a professional archaeologist working in a lab, so he was used to writing articles and all that. So that's, but he came through the program because he wanted to learn more about Gemmology. And he did a bibliographic report about the geographical origin of turquoise, an interesting topic. And then he did an experimental report on pseudoite. Pseudoite is a chlorite that has been used by a little-known civilization of the Antilles, French Antilles, so the Caribbeans in a way, to make objects, sacred objects probably. So actually, when he came to join the program, he had written an article about that. No, he had written an article about the general archaeology of the place, but I saw the name in the list of materials. I saw pseudoite. I said, well, I don't know, what is pseudoite? And said, well, it's a kind of a chlorite. It's difficult to identify because of this, that, and that. And I told him, why don't you take that as a subject for your DUG? Because you have already done a lot of work, and now all needs to be done is to improve on it. And so, to make a long story short, he turned into his his bibliographic report into an article for the archaeological community, and his experimental report will be published with some modification, of course, in Gems and Gemmology next issue or the issue after that. So that's sort of establishing a record there. I don't demand that of all my students. If they just do a good bibliographic report, a good experimental report, even if you rediscover the wheel, we don't ask for more than that, actually. That's pretty good, pretty good exercise.
If already you know how to write a report and make something that can be useful to other people, this is already something that is... Actually, this PhD is that you are showing that you are able to make a research work on Express and put everything in order in a way that other people will be able to use it.
Yeah, because there's no difference between writing a good scientific report and writing a good scientific article.
Yeah.
A good technical report and a good scientific article. Structure is the same. Every time I've tried for one reason or another to deviate from that, guess what? After a while I say, there is something that's not satisfactory about this article, and I get back to the good old layout. And I think there is a good reason for that. That's very rare that you can really do something totally original in a scientific article. Very difficult. And if you don't do that, usually the reviewers, the people that evaluate your article before publication, they'll kill you dead.
I know.
They said, "Oh, where is that part? What have you done? Where is it?" So it'd be very difficult to publish in a scientific article if you don't follow that well-known thing. You have the introduction, you have the bibliographic report, basically what's known on the subject at this point in time, and these are my samples, these are my techniques, these are my results, and then you finish by a discussion. Hopefully you have something new to say, and a conclusion, and the bibliography. Very important. Anyway, that takes us a little bit away from the color article, but that's the way the color article is. The color article is a review article. That's a different structure. So it takes a bunch of already published articles and synthesize all the information in one spot. Very useful when it's well done.
Yeah.
Well, that was why I like this article, this series of 3 articles, because for 2001, when I studied Gemmology, to many years later, and still up to now, this is when people ask me about something about color, I say, well, you should read that one. And then there are a few additions, but actually not so many things have changed. On most
I think the thing that we have most seen in the last few years is the impact of theoretical chemistry. As we saw, I thought that someone in discussion actually recognized that the program for diamond was MPro from Newcastle University. Thank you for them, Newcastle upon time. Very good beer there. The other thing is also recognizing the role of clusters. In a sense, the origin of the brown color in diamond is clusters of defects. But for example, there are recent publications about clusters of OH in garnets were important to understand certain facts we couldn't explain otherwise in garnets, and certain properties of pink to red tourmaline. When you get an almost red tourmaline, you realize it's almost not pleochoric anymore. And you tend to worry about it because, this is clearly uniaxial and it's hardly pleochoric anymore. What's going on? And actually, part of it is the role of clusters, actually, in the absorption. So that's the new developments in the field. And I think we've seen a small amount of method based on magnetism called the electron spin resonance. It's a bit like luminescence. It's a method that's extremely sensitive. So sensitive that it's almost dangerous to use. Because you get a signal. That's a good point. But then interpreting the signal requires a lot of work. You can actually simulate even the signal. And the interpretation is usually not that clear at first. So use a little bit that technique, but for the moment, it has not been preponderant in Gemmology. They've used it at GIA in particular to see if there is isolated nitrogen in diamonds. That works well for that. There is a really nice signal for isolated nitrogen. And so that's easy to recognize. So if you can't see it in infrared, but you suspect there is isolated nitrogen, because you may have a spectrum of color, actually, that you would think is isolated nitrogen, you can always use that technique to double check that there is indeed isolated nitrogen in diamond. Not always an easy diagnostic to make based on simply infrared.
In Colorstone, well, mainly I was working in column. The main difference between what you have written at this time was the arrival of the barium treatment. And then there was a lot of work that was done on that, and there was some advancement, but still now, the main thing is, for example, we still don't really understand the color in paparacha, and why, there are several types of sapphire where the color is changing.
Thanks for the example. I'll give you the answer I said I could give. Probably oxygen vacancies. There is probably oxygen vacancies involved in there. No, more seriously, this is something actually we are working on, because we are working at the moment with an intern on the orange luminescence of corundum. And that's actually linked with the defects that give the orange color of beryllium diffuse corundum.
Yeah.
So this has to be considered as a plus. And you're right, what happened with this is John Emmett, to call his name, is a big expert in there. John was very good at teaching the gemological community that you have actually to respect what is called electroneutrality of the crystal. That is, in the corundum, you have aluminum, which is 3+. Now, if you stick a 2+, well, you need to have a 4+, for example, or a 1+, to compensate for it. And I think the article was a magistral lesson in take care of electroneutrality if you want to explain defects in corundum. And he had some pretty powerful demonstration of that. He did all kinds of special treatments and stuff to demonstrate that. And I think in that way, you're right, that opened the eyes of many gemologists on the complexity of some of those defects, yes.
But again, it's a little bit the same as with what you said about the brown diamond on, this defect. We had to get a serious problem like the barium treatment in order for some people to start to really,
Yes.
look at the problem and try to find,
And even with the barium treatment, look, I mean, the color center that gives the orange absorption, that's a broadband, semi-broadband, that's around 480, so it absorbs the blue, therefore it gives the orange color. Okay. All you find, even in the most recent publication involving John and his usual associates, is it's a hole center. Now that's that's about the same thing as the name of the rose. You put a name on it, but you still don't know what it is. It's a hole center. What is a hole? The hole is the contrary of an electron. So people usually have some notion of what an electron is. It's an elementary negative charge. The hole is just the contrary. So it's the elementary positive charge. And when you associate the two, they neutralize each other. So saying it's a hole center, you haven't said much yet, What is it caused by? So that's where it was almost a joke, but, it's in an oxide, so it could be related to oxygen vacancies. And actually, it is oxygen vacancies in corundum. They are called F centers traditionally. That's the old F is for Farbe, color, actually, in German. Farbe, Zentrum, in German. F centers in English. And there are oxygen vacancies, actually, the F centers. Now, exactly what F centers do you have? You can have several charges, actually. I mean, the work on barium brought attention to the fact that you have a charge to those defects, and globally, the charge has to be neutral, so you have to manage the charges. So, for example, if you have an oxygen vacancy, maybe you need to have a 2+ nearby to compensate, and so on and so forth. So actually, it gets very complicated. You have no way to directly look at the defect. The only approach that's going to be very useful is going to be theory, again.
Statistic, you think?
And there's a Chinese guy who published recently some theory on corundum, and he was saying that some of the defects you find all over the literature as responsible for this and that in corundum. Some of those defects, some variety of the F center is actually not stable, he's saying. So, back to square one for us. So this is very complex. This whole area of defects, they can be very important to the commercial value of a gem, but that doesn't mean they are easy to study and understand.
Yeah, and I receive regular questions when I go to the mine, especially, for example, in Madagascar, where you have people, they take out from the ground some pinkish orange stone, and then they put them on the sun, on aluminum paper at 12, and some stone, the color become more orangey, some stones, the color become more pink, and many people. And then after that, there is just no way for them to know what was the color before. And
so what you're describing is an interest.
And they were more or less the same color. So some stone increase color with sun, some stone decrease color with sun, just right after the mine, after being mined.
And what you're describing is called photochromism. That's what you see in the Pegmatite variety of sodalite, but also in some yellow varieties of corundum, but you see that in many diamonds, actually, more than people think. Pink diamonds, actually, can be very photochromic. Photochromism is just the fact that you have defects, we don't know what they are, but you have electrons kicking around in the system. And you have an electron moving from one side to the next. And on one side, it doesn't absorb light. In the next side, it will absorb light.
Yeah.
And that's a bit hard to understand, perhaps, but that electron is not very strongly attached. It sort of circulates between two sites. And when you put UV on it, you give it energy, you kick it in the other side, and all of a sudden you see more absorption. Now you get back in the dark, it returns to the original color. So actually, we have an article coming out in Journal of Gemmology on photochromic gem, because I have my Ph.D. student, Theodore Blumentritt, working on photochromism in Akmanite, which is an old subject, because Akmanite is, as a variety, is far more than 100 years old. But the detailed mechanism is still not really clear. And despite recent publications, if you look carefully, it's not very clear. And also we looked into photochromic scapulite, which is a fairly new thing. You know, the scapulite that are colorless, you put the UV on them and are a beautiful dark blue, like a machichi beryl blue almost. And some say sapphire blue, if you will. But these phenomena are a bit hard to understand. In the case of Akmanite and scapulite, clearly they are related to a small amount of sulfur being present in the structure. These two minerals have what is called a cage structure. You may have heard of zeolites also having a cage structures. You have what you could call a cage that is built with silica or alumina tetrahedra. And that makes a large volume in which other molecules can come, and you can have chlorine, for example, or you can have a sulfate molecule, which is rather large, SO4 minus, you know, -2, that's pretty big. The chlorine goes in with sodium to keep the neutrality, actually, and so on and so forth. So you have three of these silicates with cages. You have the sodalite, so that gives you the Akmanite variety. You have the scapulite, which is photochromic, as Akmanite is photochromic. And you have tuctopite also, in which the only difference between sodalite and tuctopite is in the cage, instead of having just aluminum and silicon, you have some beryllium in there. But that's among the constituents of the cage. So it doesn't change much what happens in the cage. And tuctopite is also photochromic. It rarely goes to completely colorless, but it can. And often it goes from what people like to call a raspberry color, so let's see, a pinkish purple color, to simply that same color but darker under UV. And then it goes back. So these are due to special kinds of defects. I mean, they are the same defect that give the stable color, except that in that case, due to specific details of the environment, I should say, well, you have the electron that can move around a little bit, you know, it goes, sees the neighbor, say, hi neighbor, and then comes back. But when he sees hi neighbor, there is absorption of light and the color changes. So understanding that and how fast that happens, by the way, this can have interesting industrial application. You can make optical memories if you have a fast enough system, because you have your 0 would be colorless and your 1 would be dark color. So if you have very fast changing system, you could use them for memories for computers, optical memories. So not magnetic memories, which are sometimes a problem because they can be perturbed by magnetism, or there are, of course, all kinds of memories, but that's one possibility. So we have to learn from nature. That's what we call mineralomimetism. Take the property you're interested in nature, try to understand it in nature, copy it in a man-made product, or even improve on it. Once you understand, there's a good chance you can improve on it, actually. Add more sulfur to get a darker color, for example, and so on and so forth. It's not so easy. Huh? Don't believe that... because you have to do mineral synthesis, and for example, we try to do synthetic scapulite as a powder, and not even a single crystal, but Theodore did synthetic scapulite containing sulfur. That's the first in the world, actually. It's never been done before. And so we could see the luminescence related to the S2 minus centers, but we haven't managed yet to reproduce photochromic scapulite. What we've done, actually, is kind of amusing. We all got a bit frustrated with the fact we couldn't get the photochromic scapulite. Say, well, let's put a whole bunch of sulfur in there. Let's not worry too much about modifying the condition and just see what happens. So basically, he stuck a whole bunch of sulfur. It's a high pressure thing, you know, it's not that easy to do. And lo and behold, what he got was you get a colorless scapulite with blue sodalite inclusions, which is something you find in nature. Yeah. So we actually reproduce nature, but not for what we want it to do. So you don't always do what you want, but at least we are working in the right direction. But it just illustrates how difficult it is. In the first example, not enough sulfur, we only got the luminescence, which is also sulfur related. In the other case, too much sulfur, but maybe one day we'll manage to do just the right amount, or there is something missing, we don't know what it is, and the day we will put it in, it will work. We'll just have to wait and see.
It's the same as a funny thing with a synthetic corundum or natural corundum. In nature, when you have a corundum, ruby or sapphire with iron, you can have big clean crystal, but synthetic, we don't know how to put iron in a synthetic corundum.
That's right. It evaporates generally in the process, yeah. So, well, that's for the melt techniques. You can do it with a little more, well, not a little more easy, at least you can manage to stick iron in the corundum using a flux technique. But then that's not something that is very, you have articles about that, but that's not something you can do very easily. Because, for example, in a synthetic blue sapphire done with a flux method, you do have some iron.
Yeah, but to do, for example, to do high iron standard.
Yeah, you can't do high iron. Yeah, that's right. You can't do a yellow synthetic sapphire that way.
It was asking to get a yellow sapphire, natural one, from Australia, from Thailand, Asia, and he took some from Yogo in order, because he wanted to have a piece of corundum with a very even content of chromium, but could not get that in a synthetic stone. So we had a natural piece in order to get for the in corundum standard for ADIC PMS in corundum.
Yeah, that's a difficult one to get indeed.
And when you look
as an interesting thing in synthetic yellow corundum, it's nickel that's in there.
Yeah. But
nickel, so it's not something you find in nature.
A limitation somewhere because
it was the best proxy. So it raises the question of why you call a synthetic, since it has no equivalent in nature.
Yeah.
But the equivalence is not on structure, but on the origin of color. So I raised that question in the past, actually, but there is no easy answer. Let's put it that way. So rather than wasting my time arguing endlessly, we carry on with what we know how to do.
Yeah, I agree.
What we know and what we can do.
So maybe let's do a few more questions from the audience. There's a few in there. So let's go back to the brown diamond for a second that we were talking about earlier. Mubashir Mansour asking... okay, well, he says he's a huge fan of your paper with Dr. Thomas from GGTL, and he wants to ask about that. So what is your opinion on the vacancy cluster hypothesis for CVD brown diamond?
Okay. Yeah, that's true that this has been demonstrated on natural brown diamond, but not on synthetic CVD diamond. Now, the question remains open. The simple answer is, as one of my colleagues from De Beers put it, I say, well, yeah, but then why do you have this very fine brown layer on synthetic CVD diamond? I mean, how does that jibe with vacancy clusters? And the answer is, what else could it be? I don't know if they have done the proper positron annihilation work on the CVDs. I mean, it may be, but it's difficult to keep up with absolutely all the literature. And sometimes it's only when you're on a subject that you actually manage to know all of the topics. But I'm not sure if they have managed that. I mean, it's the most likely hypothesis. But the problem is, how do you explain that it's related with the presence of nitrogen? That I'd like to have an explanation.
Well, then that's what he wants to know.
I don't have one at the moment.
Well, he's wondering, would you consider nitrogen-hydrogen complex defects?
Well, the absorption spectrum doesn't quite jibe with that, but it's an endless discussion. I mean, it's very difficult. It's a featureless absorption spectrum. It's what's called a continuum. It goes from one side of the spectrum continuously to the other side of the spectrum. There is no maxima or very small ones, which are not exactly what you're interested in. And that's a heavy-duty topic, basically. That's at least a PhD to answer the question, perhaps more.
So that's
so I'm not going to say anything definitive on that.
Yeah, that could be somebody's future project then.
Absolutely.
Okay, another question from the same questionnaire. He says, talking about nitrogen and diamond, he'd love to know if you think, could it be that the ratio of positive single substitutional nitrogen, which is EPR inactive, compared to its neutral counterpart is incorrectly interpreted in the literature?
Okay, so we have the whole problem of identifying how much nitrogen and which kind of nitrogen you have in the diamond. And that's true that for a while, it wasn't realized that we have invisible nitrogen with the infrared, for example, which is you may have nitrogen in the diamond that you can't see with the classical means of investigating diamond. And usually for nitrogen, you rely on infrared absorption. So there is a small amount, it's been demonstrated to be less than 20 ppm, but as I said, 1 ppm is enough to color a diamond. So less than 20 ppm of nitrogen, which is not infrared active in a diamond, you may be able to see it via other techniques, possibly ESR, for example, electron spin resonance, we mentioned earlier. I think that it's very difficult to, in all diamonds, be able to say for sure how nitrogen is present. I mean, we clearly know that in some cases we have A aggregates, B aggregates, platelets, and so on and so forth. But even quantifying that is not always easy. But for the isolated nitrogen, you have so much varieties of and variations of isolated nitrogen that I don't think it's very easy to clearly say, well, we have half a ppm of this nitrogen, and then we have 2 ppm of that one, and perhaps 0.1 ppm of that third category of isolated nitrogen. So I think that's something we are getting to know better now, but really addressing nitrogen in detail in one given diamond, let alone all diamonds, but one specific diamond, is a very difficult topic, actually. Okay. So yes, there is more to be learned about isolated nitrogen, that's for sure.
Okay. Okay, so we talked about your article. We talked about a little bit about the DUG. What are you working on now? What's your current projects in life besides teaching?
Okay. Well, there is the DUG, of course, which has been a bit of a problem with the COVID situation. So we're working hard at catching up. We're in the catch-up mode now, but that will happen. Now, in terms of the research projects, I mentioned the two major research projects we have now, which is the Ph.D. of Emmanuel Fritsch, which is coming to an end on photochromic sodalite and photochromic scapulite. So he's in a redaction phase of that. So it's there are still experiments going on. There's a couple of experiments we really like to be able to do, but it's been very difficult to manage because we need to adapt it existing experiments, and with the COVID situation, the providers of some very specific equipment were not responding. Most of their people were at home actually, and so we've been frustrated with that. But we have learned a lot about the photochromism of sunlight. Actually, that's for sure. We have restricted the number of hypotheses, and we don't think that's what necessarily published is necessarily correct. Actually. So more to come when the final word is available on that. Photochromic scapulite, also sulfur related. There was no understanding at all when we started on that. I think we've developed an understanding, and we have actually given the proof that the orange luminescence of scapulite is indeed due to a couple of sulfur atoms. So it's a disulfur, if you want, unit. With a minus charge, the S2 minus. And that was said all over in the literature, but when you look carefully, you realize it was never proved. So we proved that, and that was not easy. To prove something that's hearsay, we spent some time with that. Theory helped a lot, actually, on that one. And the other topic that I have with an intern now is this orange luminescence of corundum, which led us to actually all the other luminescence of corundum, what we know well in corundum is, of course, the chromium 3 plus luminescence, and then the blue shortwave only titanate related luminescence, even if some people think it's something else. Frankly, we've looked hard at that topic over the years, and I don't see what else it could be. But then you have orange luminescence, whole center, as we said earlier. But then you have the green luminescence appearing in shortwave, like in the Chatham synthetic lucifers and that sort of thing. And many labs use it now as an indication of heat treatment, actually, of lucifer. You see that green luminescence rarely, but when you see it, it may help to diagnose heat treatment. And there is also a yellow luminescence that we discovered just by chance, but we're wondering if the yellow is not, the yellow could be a variation of another one. Corundum, the lesser known corundum luminescence is a big topic at the moment, but also we like to do other things. I have written in French an article also on dissolved dislocation that has nothing to do on color, actually. It's just weird inclusions that gemologists had a hard time interpreting because precisely they are empty. So, when you're a gemologist, you see a needle inclusion, you like to see this needle is such and such a mineral. Now, when it's empty, what do you do? Okay, so there are two categories that we studied in the past few years, that we published on in the past few years, but not enough yet. One category is dissolved dislocation, and we just finished studying two absolutely spectacular dumburite crystals from Mogok with Lutz Nasdala, my colleague from the University of Wien. And actually, in continuity, he sent to me a fantastic green zircon, which has actually dissolved dislocation in the form of ribbons. We had noticed that actually in our original study of dissolved dislocation, that they develop as ribbons in zircon, but we have no idea why that is the case. So that's questions that we have. In the background, I'm always a big addict of diamond morphology. So one of these days, I might be able to finally publish that book that was written in 2004 and never published. For example, I've been looking at some of the very small crystals available in Judith Smilledge collection at University College London with the help of a colleague over there, Adrian Jones. And we are looking in all kinds of directions, and sometimes through the digs we are able to explore a little part of one or another problems. But if we could have continuous funding, that'd be great to really work at the subject that we've been looking at for an entire career, like the iron titanium conundrum, and be able to do a significant step forward would be very nice, actually. That's something I'd very much like to do in the coming 10 years.
Regarding the dislocation, did you see the dislocation in a phenakite? The ones that are circular, like hexagon?
In phenakite, okay. We did see some dissolved dislocation in phenakite, but I'm not sure we're talking about the exact same ones. Dissolved dislocation, you mean an helix type? Is that it? Are you sure it's a dissolved dislocation?
It's a dislocation. Okay. It's empty. In my opinion, it's empty, and it looked like hexagonal, perpendicular to the z-axis.
Okay, because you find things like that in spinel, for example. Yeah. But now phenakite, I don't have. I know that we did study one phenakite which had dissolved dislocation, but there were not anything specific. They are usually curved, actually, dissolved dislocation. That's not exactly extraordinary, but if it's a nice helix, I'd like to see that. Yeah. Send me pictures at least, or of course it's better if we can have the specimen itself, but I understand it's not always possible. But at least pictures to get an idea what's going on. Yeah.
It would be possible. I have the stone in my collection, but
that's something that we see more and more of. Actually, it's the same story as with origin of color. When you know what you're looking for, you find a lot more.
Okay, I will try to bring you the stone back next time I will come in France. Then I will
be glad to look at. You can send it by post. It works.
Yeah, but I have to go back to Thailand first, and then.
Okay, yeah, that's another problem. Yeah. Especially with quarantine at the moment and all that.
No,
I understand I'm not about ready to see the specimen?
No, I have a photo I can send you right after.
Okay, send me pictures. That'll be best.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, as a person who's doing teaching, and also you obviously have a lot of ongoing research projects, how do you organize all this kind of stuff in your life? Are you just doing research on the nights and the weekends, or is it part of your daily work schedule?
Okay, well, the best answer to that is with difficulty. But really what we do is, the problem of a university professor in France is that we do teaching, we do research, and we also are responsible for administratively. For example, I'm the administrative responsible for the Duc program. And I also involved in a master's program in a much smaller way. So we combine several things, and we juggle with it. There are, for example, the first trimester being from September to Christmas, I don't have a chance to do much research because there is a lot of teaching during that trimester. So I concentrate on that. Of course, if there's an article in process, I'll keep working at it, because the people in scientific journal don't give you all the time you want. They give you a few weeks to. So sometimes it comes to, you work late at night sometimes, but or on weekends, like I'm just doing. But that's not always the case. It's not always the case. So personally, I more and more try to keep time for myself, and what I love to do, I'm able to stick my nose in my garden. For example, I have a small garden, but I really enjoy playing with that. And my grandfather was an horticulturist, so that's where I got it from. And also have a look at my twin crystal collections, looking in detail at some of the specimen. I have some really weird stuff. So actually, I really enjoy that. It relaxes me, so I try to keep some time available for that, but it's always a challenge. My kids are more or less grown up. My youngest one is 17, so basically he's under his own power mostly. So much less demand from that. But it's difficult to organize. All my colleagues have the exact same problems. I think they are a worldwide problem. In France, we are lucky that we have, compared to, for example, some of my British colleagues, there are far more teaching to do than we have. And we are, in a sense, in France, we are relatively protected as university professor compared to other, which are always under competition and always under the threat of being kicked out or having to move to another university or be involved in that or that program that they are not interested in. So I appreciate that relative freedom. Of course, things could be better, always could be better, but they can be much worse as well. So I'm acutely aware of that. So I try to, I enjoy that, but I really enjoy, often between colleagues, say, don't say anything to anybody, but I did research today. It's like being able to dedicate a full day to research is like, oh my God. And because we do a lot of work just accompanying our Duc students, for example, which is not always the most, it's interesting, but it's not the thing you necessarily want to do at that point in time.
Yeah.
But that's part of being a teacher, you have to repeat things over and over again and to different people over the years. So we understand that. We're in a job. We know this is part of the job, so that's okay.
Yeah.
But that's true. Sometimes we'd have to have more time, and a good way to get time for research is actually to get funding for a Ph.D. student. So I'm putting the funding main fund. If I had funding for maybe no more than 2 or 3 Ph.D. at the same time, because after that, if you have very good students, they keep you so busy. I have that problem with an intern at the moment. The guy is so active. He's supposed to be there for only a few months, and he's done so much in a few months. And so you want a few good students, a few good men, to paraphrase a famous movie title.
So then,
women are welcome, by the way. This is not in any way a sexist.
So if you're mentoring PhD students, you're getting pretty intimately involved with their projects then, like you're part of it.
Absolutely. I mean, you are the one who actually proposed the subject to start with. Usually the student sees a project and is interested in that. And so you are at the very beginning of the project. So of course you follow that project with great interest. You help the students. Some a chance that, for example, my PhD student currently, Fyodor, he's under his own power. I don't need to be every day or every hour check on him to see what he's doing. No, that's not the kind of guy. So he does good things. He takes initiative. He talks to the right people. He's able to get himself out of a tight spot most of the time. And so I'm there for general advice and true scientific discussions. We don't have to spend too much time dealing with everyday issues. That's very nice. That's very, very nice. So you're always happy to have very good students that are actually a help. So jokingly, I call them my slaves. They know it's a joke.
You guys
I tell them they are not slaves because the slaves, you buy them. Well, I didn't buy them, so they are not slaves.
It seems like
they are the one doing the work for me. So in a sense, you can't progress in research if you don't have students helping you with the work. So the PhD students, and to a lesser extent interns, especially good ones, are really the force behind research, more than the professor itself, who is overburdened with all kinds of things that he has to do. And on his own, he can't do a lot of research. He needs help. He needs other people. It used to be that we had people dedicated to help us with research in the past, but with budget restrictions, this is long gone.
Wow, you're giving me so many new ideas. I never considered a research assistant. Now I'm going to have to think of new...
Yeah, well, it's an interesting area for the one who don't mind the unknown. I've noticed in my career that even some of my friend engineers, for example, I say, well, I couldn't do research. You never know what you're going to do. That's precisely that's what I find exciting. But some people don't like it. You need everybody to make a good world. So I'm not criticizing them. I just say it's not for everybody. But if you have the right mindset for doing research, then you can get very helpful and help to get things moving forward.
Okay.
So,
what would be your advice for, this will be recorded, so you have young people will find this talk, and young people who want to do, who are interested in Gemmology and who want to do research. What would be your basic advice to them?
Okay, well, just go in there slowly. Make sure you really like Gemmology and not something else. When you're very young, sometimes you like something for a while. It's like a quote-unquote a phase. So make sure you're really interested in that. For example, try to get a classical Gemmology diploma, by correspondence. When you're young, you can do that. So when you see that, usually it's pretty obvious after a year or so of connection with someone who expressed an interest, whether that person is very serious or just a passing interest. So once you're sure that you have a very serious customer, if I may say so, then that person has to understand there is always be room for the best. So after work, it's not so much a question of luck, or it's a question of hard work. And so if you want to get into that, you'll have to fight for the spot. You have to fight for the spot to be an intern. You have to fight for the spot to be a PhD student. But it will work if you keep hacking at it, And I think it's true from not just from research, but for just about everything in life, that if you work hard at it, you'll get it. So I always encourage the younger people to just, there is no big mystery. In the GIA classes in the old days, there was a little anecdotes, they had boxes with anecdotes, which are cool. And I remember vividly that one. There was one guy that was telling another guy, they were older guys, he was talking about his son. He said, well, it's funny, your son really got lucky with, he did that great thing recently, how lucky he is and all that. And the father of the said son looks at him and says, well, that's a funny thing I've noticed. The harder he works, the luckier he gets. So I think there is a lot to be learned from that. If you want to get lucky, work hard.
Yeah, and work smart a little bit. Sometimes
What's that?
Work smart also.
Yeah, but that's part of it, because if you work hard, I've seen many examples. you end up talking to many different people in the area, and you get known. I remember a vivid example. We had how do you call these guys? A young guy that was 14, that was super gifted in a special school for that, and he wanted to work on luminescence of minerals. And so you get this kind of calls, from the mom, for example, and you're like, okay. You're very hesitant to get involved in that. And so you say, well, I'd rather speak to your son than speak to you. So could you put him online, please? Then you start talking to the guy and you realize he's already talked to just about anybody you would have thought of in the field of luminescence in minerals in California, if not in the entire US. And then you're like, this guy is what, 14? You're like, my God, okay, this one really deserves help. So we did help this guy, actually. And when he moved on, he went into what he himself called, in the last mails I got for him, he went into a very special situation in the American Army, if you see what I mean. Very bright guy involved with things that he's not authorized to talk about, I think. That's what it meant. Because he sent me stones, actually, from Afghanistan later on, and that sort of thing. So I don't know what became of him. His name is Matthew McCann, and I'd really love to have news from Matthew, if anybody does. I hope he just didn't go out into too dangerous a situation. He's no longer with us, but I really wish I could news from him. Maybe he can't give news. That happens sometimes. But
bunker somewhere.
If anybody, I've lost touch with his mom. His mom is probably still alive and probably could help me. But anyway, so this guy had already done whatever you could imagine. You would yourself have done, and he was 14. So when you consider that, you say, well, this guy is going to get where he wants. But when he kept going, we did a couple of gem news, actually, with some of the stone he sent from Afghanistan, published in Gems and Gemmology. Yeah,
that's cool.
Okay. Well, I have maybe I will try to remember his name and see if I will meet him one day in Kabul.
Well, he's no longer in Afghanistan. I think he moved to Syria, actually. I think the last I heard, he was in Syria.
Okay.
But you can imagine the kind of occupation he has. He did send me some pictures from the camp he was in Syria with all kinds of fancy-dancy equipment, the super sophisticated drones and the like. And I was a bit surprised he was allowed to send out those pictures, but he did. George Osman had lots of contact with him also at some point, so he would like to know, I'm sure, also.
Okay.
Here's another quick question from the audience. So this is from Farhan Faizi asking, what would you like maybe a potential new student to research on corundum for the DUG? Like if you were going to give
okay, in the DUG, I like to give topics that are very square, not too ambitious, because otherwise it's very disappointing for the student. He works a lot and not much comes out. So usually I keep away from exploratory topics, but usually what we can do is work on a specific collection and look at one aspect of a specific collection of gems, gem corundums, for example. There is lots to be done. This is to be discussed with the students because he may like corundum or he may like better something else. Lots of people wish to work on pretty rare stones, for example. As long as there are samples available, you can work on a given topic. The difficulty often is finding the appropriate samples. We've done extensive work on corundum at the moment, so there may be an aspect or two that we may want to get deeper into, but usually the subjects for experimental topics come from a discussion with the student, and they go zigzagging. Sometimes we start in diamond and we go in corundum, then we end up in tourmaline, and finally the subject is on garnets. Because you have to find the right topic that is small enough that it be satisfactory for the student. You'll see something happening in the time he has available to work, and they'll keep motivated by the subject. Not abandon the subject, which is another difficulty sometimes. And, we have to have the samples available, and that's another difficulty. So sometimes we loan samples. Sometimes I love it when the students come with their samples, actually. They want to study this or that, often it's garnets or spinel or tourmaline, that sort of thing. And tourmaline, for example, it's not a very good subject for the Duc because now we have 33 different species of tourmaline. So just identifying the right species might be in itself a challenge. So working on tourmaline, you may work on another aspect of tourmaline. It's people don't realize the complexity of tourmaline.
It's a trash of pegmatite. So
what's that?
One friend told me one day that his definition of tourmaline was a trash can of pegmatite. You can find.
Yeah, well, actually, that's Victor Goldschmidt's word on tourmaline. Victor Goldschmidt, the father of geochemistry, called tourmaline a trash can, basically. Just you put everything in there, it works. So, you can find about 30 different elements for the periodic classification of elements in tourmaline.
One of the most complex...
just to give you an example, there was a cute sample I got from Madagascar, a tourmaline as cut as a cube to display pleochroism. So I thought that was a nice thing to have in the showcases, and so people can play with it. And we never bothered to identify the species. And one day I had to train someone on chemistry, and there was that sample which has a flat surface, well polished and all that, perfect for chemical analysis. I said, hey, let's take that one and figure it out, okay? Oh boy. So we got stuck an entire morning with this sample because it's not elbaite. Maybe not enough calcium for lidicotite. Well, to make a long story short, it was fluorsilicite. And I'm sure at the time the guy got the specimen, he had no idea. First, the species didn't even exist, wasn't even described. Yeah. And it took a lot. Even our chemist, our engineer for the analysis on the SCM, he got involved because looking on the internet and said, what the hell this chemistry could fit with? And finally, we found fluorsilicite. Okay, so it's just to show you that tourmaline may be very difficult from the point of view of establishing the species. Yeah. I mean, there are ways you can do that relatively easily if you have the right equipment, but that's not our specialty. We don't have the right equipment or experience, so we leave it to others, actually. Mm. There are a few people who are very good specialists of tourmaline around the world. And so if you have a tourmaline that is a bit of a challenge, send it to them. So like they may send to me something for origin of color or dislocations, Mm-hmm. So everybody has his specialty. You can't know everything about everything else. So all the gems or all the minerals, and so you discover a new material every day as inclusions or even as gems. And I discovered by chance a new gem species. Actually, what is it called? It's a copper sulfate. And I found an ice cab mixed in with a bunch of varicite in Tucson, actually. I was interested in varicite, so I needed to buy some varicite cap cheap. So I have a place I go to in JGX for that. Mm-hmm. And a bunch of varicite. In the midst of that, there was one that didn't quite look like a varicite, if you see my thing. And I got it out of curiosity. I said, well, I'm going to get that one too. It was only, $10 perhaps. So I got it, and I put it aside, and I did my project on varicite. And so maybe a year later, I like, oh boy, what is this thing? Maybe I should do a Raman spectrum or do chemistry or whatever. Turned out to be a copper sulfate called deviline. Never heard of it before. I still have to write a note to say that deviline might exist as a gem. And I suspect it might be from Australia because it was mixed in with varicite from Australia. So
that's one of the things with Gemmology. They will all the time something to learn. We'll all the time find something.
Any field of human activity, really, not just Gemmology. I mean, I am involved with an association of experts. Some people deal with old weapons, for example. Other people deal with jewelry. That's how I got into that group. Fabrics, for example, experts in fabrics, that's another world. What do we have? Of course, painting, but usually that is subdivided into drawings and paintings and prints and this kind of print or whatever. I mean, there's always something to learn in any field of human activity. I don't think we should look at Gemmology as something that's really unique in terms of human activity. It really follows the same rules of most fields of human activity. And we shouldn't perceive ourselves as exceptional. That's a very bad excuse.
The funny thing with Gemmology is that you can, if you're working, for example, with gemstone, even some very well-known gemstone, like for example, ruby and sapphire, there is a new deposit every 2 or 3 months.
Yeah, true.
That's just, okay, you have the list, you have the book, and then, you go around and you meet people. Oh, they have a stone that is coming from somewhere nobody has ever written. And maybe the stone have inclusion that nobody has ever written about also. So basically, to find something that is new in a kind of classic topic like Gemmology is actually quite easy. Every year you have 2 or 3 new things.
Absolutely.
If you are really curious about it, you can get one of these things in your hands and say, oh, nobody has ever worked on that, and it's in my hands. It's funny.
Right.
Yeah, that's what I like.
Well, shall we wrap it up, guys? We've had a pretty enlightening conversation, I think. I'm definitely going to have to watch this when I get on YouTube just to go through all, or better yet, I'm going to reread your article, and everyone else should also reread your article or read it if they haven't read it already. It's on Vincent's Facebook page, so if you haven't read it, the link is there. And I think also anyone watching this on YouTube who wants to go deeper will probably enjoy a couple of the other ones we've had already, Vincent, right? Emily and John Emmett were both kind of talking about some things we talked about tonight, trapped holes and the origin of color and stuff like that. So there's some other, if you're watching this on YouTube and you want to keep going for 4 more hours, there's 2 more webinars that you can watch that are somewhere over here on this list. So
yeah, it will be maybe 5 more hours because I think they were about 2 hours and a half each.
Yeah, exactly.
There is about 5 hours on the subject. Yeah.
So Emmanuel, thank you so much for the time and all the interesting information. For people that want to find you on the web, your website CV is up there. Your Facebook, I heard you're not on Facebook too much, but maybe people can find you there.
No, but I'm not a very modern man in that aspect. Not exactly on social networks, but we'll try to improve.
Well, and I know on this website, if people want to email you, your email address is right at the top. So if people want to talk to you about the Doog or anything else.
Yeah, absolutely. The email is, no, you don't have my email address.
Oh, yeah, it's on the page, though. I think if you just type in your name into Google.
Well, it's not very difficult. You put Emmanuel Fritsch with the right spelling, and you add Nantes and Gems, and you're sure for right on there.
Okay.
So, I'm relatively easy to find on the net.
Cool.
So thank you very much, Justin and Vincent.
It's been a pleasure.
It was a pleasure to host you. And hopefully one of these days I will be able to fulfill my dream to go to do some work on stuff somewhere in Nantes.
You're most welcome. Most welcome.
Project about that I have to speak with you about. But
Okay. That's another story.
Yeah.
So Vincent, we will be back here next month, July 25th. Do we know who we're talking to yet?
Nearly sure. We still have to confirm a few things, but I think it will be Giancarlo Parodi from in Paris. So we were needing some kind of diversity. So we have an Italian mineralogist. We are going to speak about mineralogy and things like that. So something very interesting. And he's a great character. So I think it will be also very interesting.
Indeed, I confirm.
So then, Emmanuel, you can watch the next one as well. You can be the question, sending questions.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, Emmanuel, maybe I'll catch you in Nantes one of these days, and Vincent, I'll catch you next month.
Okay, I might catch you in Tucson next year.
Yeah, I'll be there. So.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, see you both.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody, to join us on
Bye-bye.